I'm 35, male, and married with a daughter who is 8 years old. I've always been the go-to person when it came to helping my mom financially. Growing up, she was always around, but looking back, I realized she was incredibly manipulative and toxic. Yet, I always felt this deep obligation to help her. After all, she was my mother. I don't think anyone ever told me that it was okay not to help family, especially your mother. So, for years, I was the one bailing her out of tight spots, whether it was covering her rent, paying off her bills, or even helping her out of debt when she got into financial trouble. I wasn't the only one who noticed it, though. My husband, friends, and even some extended family members had always warned me about my mom's behavior. They said she was using me, and that I was letting her manipulate me, but I couldn't see it. Or maybe, I just didn't want to. I thought I was doing the right thing. It wasn't that I was blind to the tension it caused in my marriage or how drained I felt. But she was my mom. What was I supposed to do? I couldn't just turn my back on her. Things were getting worse, though. I'd taken out a loan just to cover the latest mess she'd gotten herself into. It wasn't just one bill or another. It was her entire financial situation. She dug herself into a hole, and I was the one she turned to. It had been years of me trying to pull back, but every time I tried, she'd guilt-trip me into helping her out. She'd say things like, "I've done so much for you, and now you can't even help me when I'm in need." I couldn't say no, so I kept giving and giving. But eventually, I hit a breaking point. I couldn't keep doing this. My family was getting stretched thin, and I was sinking under the weight of all this responsibility. My husband and I were arguing constantly about it. He didn't want me to keep giving to her, but I felt trapped. That's when I finally decided to stop. I told her I couldn't do it anymore. No more loans, no more paying her bills. She needed to figure out her life on her own. The fallout was immediate. She didn't take it well at all. It was like someone flipped a switch. The woman who had once been my mother, the one I looked up to, the one who took care of me when I was little, was gone. In her place was someone who made it clear that I was a disappointment. She started telling me I was abandoning her after everything she'd done for me. I should have seen it coming, but it still hurt. And the guilt? It was overwhelming. She made me feel like I was the worst son in the world, but somehow I stuck to my decision. That's when she hit me with the ultimatum. "If you don't help me again," she said, "I'll make sure you lose your daughter." She wasn't being vague about it. She straight up told me that she could convince CPS that I was an unfit parent. She said I was too selfish, that I didn't care about my daughter's well-being, and that I was ruining our family. It was like a punch to the gut. I didn't think she'd actually do it. It felt like one of those things parents say in a fight, empty threats. But it wasn't. A few days later, CPS showed up at my door. I couldn't believe it. I was in shock. My mom had actually gone that far. She'd called them, accusing me of neglecting my daughter, saying I was emotionally unavailable, that I was too selfish to care for her. The accusations came at me like a freight train. How could this even be happening? I tried to explain to the CPS worker that I was a good parent, that I loved my daughter, and that I wasn't the one who had caused any of this. But it didn't matter. The damage had been done. CPS started an investigation into me. It wasn't just an isolated incident either. My mom went even further. She filed for temporary guardianship of my daughter, claiming that I was unfit to raise her. She said I had financially ruined our family, and that I wasn't capable of providing the stability my daughter needed. She wanted to teach me a lesson for not helping her anymore. I had to fight back. I couldn't believe I was in this position. I had to hire a lawyer, deal with CPS visiting my home constantly, and try to defend myself against accusations that had no basis. It was draining. It felt like the world was crumbling around me. The most gut-wrenching part of it all was seeing the way my mom manipulated my daughter. She told her that I was the one who was causing all the problems and that she'd be better off with grandma. My daughter didn't understand why her grandmother, who had always been so loving, was suddenly saying all these terrible things about me. And yet, I couldn't let this happen. I had to stop her. I had to protect my family. This is just the beginning of what turned into a long and painful battle. The road ahead wasn't easy, but I knew I had to keep fighting. For my daughter, for my family, for myself. Update 1. The first few days after CPS showed up felt like a blur. It wasn't just one visit, it was constant. The social worker started coming by frequently, inspecting everything. They looked at our home, questioned me about my finances, and even asked about my parenting style. Every little thing was under a microscope. If I had a bad day, it was scrutinized. If my daughter had a rough moment, it was held against me. I started feeling like I was being treated like a criminal, and the worst part was knowing that my mom had set this entire thing in motion. The more CPS came, the worse it got. They asked me detailed questions about every part of my life, from our finances to what my daughter ate for lunch, and even what bedtime looked like at our house. Every little thing was examined. It felt like an invasion. There was nothing I could do to make them go away or stop poking into every corner of my life. It was humiliating. Meanwhile, my mom wasn't backing off. In fact, she was doubling down. She was feeding the CPS worker a twisted story of neglect, saying I'd abandoned her, that I was incapable of making decisions for my daughter, and even telling them I had disowned her. The narrative she painted was that I had turned my back on the person who had raised me, that I was so selfish I couldn't even care for my own child. It felt like I was watching a nightmare unfold in real time, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. My husband was furious. He couldn't believe how far my mom was going, and he was determined to step in and defend me. He started calling the social worker, showing up to meetings with me, and making it clear that we were a stable, loving family. But it was like my mom had already planted seeds of doubt in their minds. She had framed everything in such a way that even my defense was being questioned. The situation kept spiraling, and the more my husband pushed, the more CPS seemed unsure. It didn't help that my daughter was caught in the middle of all of this. She had always been so close to my mom, and now everything was confusing for her. Grandma, who used to spoil her with affection and love, was suddenly saying terrible things about me. She didn't understand why Grandma was accusing me of things that weren't true. My daughter started asking why she couldn't see Grandma as much, and I had to try to explain it without scaring her. I told her that sometimes people do things that aren't nice, and Grandma was upset because I wasn't helping her anymore. It wasn't easy to explain to an 8-year-old, and I could see the confusion in her eyes. She wanted to trust me, but she didn't know what to believe. I reached out to my mom, hoping to end the whole thing. I thought maybe if I called her and asked her to back off, she'd realize how far she'd gone. Maybe she'd come to her senses. I was wrong. She didn't back off. Instead, she became even more convinced that she was doing this for my own good. She said that I needed to see what I was doing to my family and that I'd be a better parent if I just listened to her. Every time I tried to make sense of it, she twisted everything into another attack on me. We decided to consult a lawyer. The situation was escalating, and I couldn't fight this on my own. The lawyer advised us that the best course of action was to prove I was a competent, stable parent and show that I could provide for my daughter. It felt like an uphill battle. My mom was using every tactic she could to make me look like the villain, and CPS had bought into some of it. As we dug deeper into the case, the lies started to unravel. We discovered that my mom had been fabricating evidence, making up stories about my behavior, trying to paint me as the irresponsible one. It was almost unbelievable how far she was going. I wasn't just fighting for my reputation, I was fighting for the custody of my daughter. My mom wasn't just trying to cause trouble, she was trying to take my child away from me. The more I learned, the angrier I became. My mom wasn't just trying to manipulate me anymore, she was manipulating my daughter. She told her that I wasn't fit to raise her, that Grandma would be a better mother. The words stung, especially when I saw how confused and hurt my daughter was. She looked up to my mom, trusted her, and now Grandma was trying to turn her against me. I wanted to lash out, but I knew that wouldn't help. I had to keep my focus on the bigger picture, my daughter's well-being. The emotional toll of everything was exhausting. Every day felt like a battle. I was constantly on edge, knowing that my mom was out there spreading lies, trying to paint me as the bad guy. My husband was stressed too. It felt like we were walking through a nightmare together, and every time we thought we could get a break, something else would happen to set us back. Then came the first major court hearing. It didn't go the way I had hoped. The CPS worker recommended that I only have supervised visits with my daughter. The judge didn't buy the lies, but they still wanted to make sure everything was safe for my daughter. It felt like a blow to the stomach. I wasn't going to lose my daughter, but the situation wasn't looking good. My mom wasn't done though. She kept planting more lies, trying to convince CPS that I was unstable, emotionally unfit, and incapable of caring for my daughter. Every visit, every meeting felt like more damage was being done. I was starting to panic. My daughter, the one person I'd do anything for, could be taken away from me because of the lies my mom had spread. I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going like this. The stakes were higher than they'd ever been. Update 2. It felt like everything was moving in slow motion. The stress was eating away at us, but something started to shift in our favor. Slowly but surely, we began to gain the upper hand in this battle. The first major sign of hope came from the support of our friends and family. They all rallied behind us, offering encouragement and, most importantly, showing that they believed in my ability as a parent. Their support meant everything. It was the strength I needed to keep going. We didn't let up on documenting everything. Every call from my mom, every threatening message, every lie she spread to CPS, nothing was left unrecorded. It felt like a small but crucial step toward proving that we weren't the ones in the wrong here. At times, it felt like we were fighting an uphill battle, but these records of everything she was doing to us were becoming our strongest weapon. One of the first things we did was take my daughter to therapy. She was confused, scared, and not understanding why Grandma was suddenly saying such awful things about her father. We didn't want to hide anything from her, but we also didn't want her to be burdened by the chaos. The therapist helped her process her feelings, explaining in ways that were easier for her to understand. It wasn't going to fix things overnight, but at least it was a start. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were making progress in healing her from the confusion my mom had caused. I knew we had to keep fighting back, but now we were doing it with evidence. I started gathering everything I could to show that I was a loving, capable parent. Photos of birthdays, school events, doctor visits, anything I could find to show that I was there for my daughter. I also got medical records, proof of stable employment, and anything else that could show that we were a solid family. It wasn't just about defending myself against the lies. It was about proving that my mom's accusations were completely false. My husband, who had been furious for weeks, decided it was time to take legal action against my mom. He couldn't stand to see me going through this, and he wasn't going to let her continue using us like this. We contacted our lawyer and began taking real steps to expose her for what she was doing. It wasn't just about protecting me, it was about protecting our daughter from being used as a pawn in this twisted game. Then came the major twist in court. During one of the hearings, the judge started getting frustrated with the lack of solid evidence from my mom's side. She had been throwing out accusations left and right, but nothing was sticking. The judge started questioning her actions and even pointed out that she had no concrete proof to back up her claims. That moment in court felt like a victory in itself. We knew we had to keep the pressure up, but it was clear that the judge wasn't buying my mom's narrative. The judge ordered a full investigation into my mom's past behavior. Our lawyer dug deep, and we uncovered something shocking. It turned out that my mom had done this before, to other family members. She had used CPS, played the victim, and emotionally manipulated everyone around her to get what she wanted. It wasn't just me she'd done this to. She had a history of trying to take control, using lies and deceit to turn people against each other. This was no longer just a fight for my daughter, it was about exposing my mom for who she truly was. With this new evidence in hand, our lawyer filed for full custody of my daughter. We were ready to take this fight to a bigger court. We weren't going to let my mom manipulate her way out of this anymore. It wasn't just about winning. It was about showing the world what she had done to us and making sure our daughter was safe from her. As we prepared for the next court battle, my mom started to retreat. She saw that the walls were closing in on her. Suddenly, she was trying to play nice, pretending that she felt remorse for everything she had done. She started sending me texts, saying that she was sorry and that she didn't want to fight anymore. But I didn't buy it. I couldn't. She'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. She had tried to take my daughter from me. There was no going back after that. We kept our focus on the bigger picture. We knew we had the upper hand now. All the evidence we had collected, the therapist's testimony, the lawyer's work, and my own records had finally started to pay off. We prepared for the final showdown in court, knowing that the truth was on our side. The day of the final hearing came. It felt like a lifetime of stress and exhaustion had built up to this moment. My mom was there, sitting on the other side, trying to maintain her calm demeanor, but I could tell she was nervous. The CPS worker who had investigated our case testified, and it was clear that they had found no evidence of neglect or abuse. They couldn't back up a single claim my mom had made. It was over for her. The judge's ruling came shortly after that. My daughter was staying with me. The judge saw through the lies, the manipulation, and the false accusations. My daughter was safe, and that's all that mattered. It was a victory, but it didn't feel like one at first. Yes, we'd won, but the cost was high. I had lost my mother, and part of me didn't know if we'd ever be able to repair that relationship. I was glad my daughter was safe, but the toll this had taken on me, my family, and my heart was something I couldn't shake. I was free from the manipulation, but I couldn't help but feel the weight of what had been lost in the process. Update 3. The court decision was a relief, but it didn't feel like an instant fix. In fact, it felt like the beginning of a much longer journey. Winning custody of my daughter was supposed to bring peace, but the emotional toll this whole ordeal had taken on me was immense. Every day felt like a struggle to get back to something resembling normal. The weight of everything that had happened, the lies, the manipulation, and the legal battles, had drained me in ways I couldn't have prepared for. But there was one thing that kept me going. I had to rebuild my relationship with my daughter. She had been through so much. For weeks, she had been subjected to my mother's twisted version of events, and it had shaken her. There were times when I could see the doubt in her eyes. She wasn't sure who to trust, who had her best interests at heart. But I was determined to show her that I was the one who would always be there for her, no matter what. We took it slow, spending more time together, creating new routines, and focusing on making sure she felt safe again. I knew it wouldn't be easy to undo the damage my mom had caused, but we were starting to move in the right direction. I also made the difficult decision to cut my mother out of my life completely. After everything she'd done using CPS against me, trying to take my daughter away, it was clear that there was no room for reconciliation. I could never trust her again. She had crossed a line that was unforgivable. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I thought about it for days, even weeks. But in the end, it was the only choice I had. I couldn't allow her toxicity to continue affecting my family. I had to put my daughter first, and I had to protect myself from further emotional manipulation. The emotional strain of everything started to hit me harder than I had expected. The relief from the court case didn't immediately translate into peace. It was like the tension was still hanging in the air, and I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next shoe to drop. But slowly, I began to heal. The guilt that had weighed me down for so long was starting to lift. I wasn't constantly looking over my shoulder, worried that my mom would somehow find a way to tear my family apart again. For the first time in years, I felt a new sense of freedom. I wasn't constantly answering to her demands, her guilt trips, or her emotional manipulation. I was free. Helping my daughter heal became my top priority. I enrolled her in therapy, where she could work through the confusion, the fear, and the anxiety my mom had caused. It wasn't an easy decision, but I knew it was the right one. The therapy sessions helped her understand what had happened, why Grandma had acted the way she did, why I had to make the choices I did, and how we could move forward as a family. Slowly, she started to find peace, and that brought me some comfort. I wasn't just protecting her from my mom's manipulation. I was giving her the tools to understand the world around her and to be strong in the face of adversity. Through this whole process, I learned some hard lessons. One of the most important lessons I learned was how to build stronger boundaries. For too long, I had let my mom manipulate me into doing things I didn't want to do. I'd allowed her to guilt trip me, make me feel responsible for her actions, and keep me trapped in her toxic behavior. No more. I began setting clear, firm boundaries with everyone in my life, especially with toxic family members. I didn't just have to protect my daughter from my mom, I had to protect myself. It wasn't about being mean or shutting people out. It was about making sure I wasn't allowing anyone to take advantage of my kindness or manipulate me into doing things that weren't in my best interest. I also realized that I had been enabling my mom's toxic behavior for years. I had been so focused on helping her, thinking I was doing the right thing, that I failed to see how much I was sacrificing. I was sacrificing my own happiness, my family's well-being, and my peace of mind. By constantly giving in to her demands, I had allowed her to manipulate me into playing a role I never should have. Once I realized this, it was easier to walk away from her for good. I wasn't abandoning her. I was finally choosing myself and my family over the never-ending emotional blackmail. The ordeal didn't just change me, it changed my marriage, too. My husband and I had been through hell together. There were days when it felt like we were both drowning in the stress of the situation, but we got through it. Our relationship grew stronger because we had learned to prioritize each other and our daughter above everything else. We supported each other through every legal battle, every emotional breakdown, and every moment of uncertainty. We learned that we were stronger together and that we could face anything as long as we were a team. As the months passed, I started to find closure. I came to terms with the fact that my mother would never change. I had spent so much of my life hoping she would, wishing that one day she would be the mother I needed. But I finally accepted that it wasn't going to happen. She had shown me who she really was, and I couldn't keep holding on to the idea of a perfect mother-daughter relationship. It was painful to let go of that dream, but I knew it was necessary for my healing and for my daughter's future. A few months after the court battle, my mom tried to reach out again. She sent a message claiming that she was sorry for everything and that she wanted to fix things, but I wasn't tempted to respond. The damage was done, and I wasn't going to fall for her manipulations again. She had already tried to take my daughter from me, and nothing she could say would undo that. I had made my decision, and I was sticking to it. Looking back, it's hard to believe how far things had gone, but I've learned a lot from this experience. I've learned how to protect my family, how to stand up for myself, and how to cut out toxic people from my life for good. It hasn't been easy, but I'm finally free, and I know that my daughter and I are stronger than ever. Update 4. A few months had passed since the court ruling. Life was starting to settle down, and I finally felt like I was moving forward. My daughter was thriving, and the weight of the past was beginning to lift. But then, out of nowhere, my mom reached out. It wasn't a phone call, but a text. She said she wanted to make amends and that she was sorry for everything. I was shocked, but not completely. I had expected something like this to happen eventually. She had been quiet for months, and now, just when things seemed to be falling into place, she was trying to weasel her way back into my life. I wasn't sure what she was trying to achieve, but I knew I had to be careful. I was skeptical, but I agreed to meet her. I told her we could meet in a neutral location, somewhere public, just to hear what she had to say. I wasn't prepared for what happened next. The moment we sat down, it was like nothing had changed. She immediately started playing the victim, just like she always had. She started crying, telling me how lonely and abandoned she felt without me. She said that I was turning my back on her when she needed me the most. At that point, I had heard enough. I couldn't take it anymore. I told her, flat out, that I couldn't forgive her for what she had done to my family, especially for using my daughter as leverage in the cruelest way possible. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my daughter and the damage she had caused. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. There was no coming back from it. But my mom wasn't done. She then tried to manipulate my daughter right in front of me. She started talking to her, saying that real grandmas don't act like that and that I didn't deserve to be a mother. I couldn't believe it. Here she was, trying to turn my daughter against me once again, even after everything that had happened. I immediately told her to stop and reminded her that if she couldn't respect my boundaries, the conversation was over. She wasn't going to manipulate me again, and she wasn't going to manipulate my daughter. That's when my mom dropped the bombshell. She threatened me with legal action. She claimed that if I didn't let her back into my life, she would go to court again, trying to prove I was unstable and that I was unfit to care for my daughter. She said she could win custody back. It was almost laughable, except I knew she wasn't joking. She had no shame. She would stop at nothing to get what she wanted. At that moment, something inside me clicked. I realized that I would never, ever be able to have a healthy relationship with her. It was over. For good. She had pushed me to my breaking point. I wasn't going to keep opening the door for her to walk back in whenever it suited her. I had to cut all ties. No more chances, no more manipulation. Without hesitation, I blocked her on all platforms, phone, email, social media, everything. I told her, very clearly, that we were done. There was no coming back from this. I wasn't going to keep putting myself or my daughter through this emotional roller coaster. We were free, and I was going to make sure it stayed that way. My husband stood by me 100%. He had been with me through every step of this journey, from the CPS investigation to the court battles, and he was fully on board with my decision to cut my mom out. He agreed that it was the best thing for our family, and he was proud of me for finally making the decision that I had been too afraid to make for so long. Together, we had fought to protect our family, and now it was time to move forward. At first, my daughter didn't understand what was happening. She noticed that Grandma was suddenly gone and she started asking questions. It broke my heart to see the confusion in her eyes. I explained to her, as gently as I could, that Grandma's behavior had been unhealthy and that it wasn't her fault. I told her that sometimes even family can act in ways that hurt us, and that I had to make a choice to protect her. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. I still felt guilty, even though I knew I had made the right decision. The guilt didn't disappear overnight. I kept wondering if I was doing the right thing by cutting my mom out of my life completely. It was a hard decision to make, but I had to prioritize my daughter's well-being. I couldn't let my mom keep wreaking havoc in our lives. To help deal with the lingering guilt and the emotional toll of everything that had happened, I started attending therapy regularly. I needed to process the years of manipulation, guilt, and emotional trauma my mom had caused me. Therapy gave me the space to work through it all and to finally start healing. Slowly but surely, I felt like I was regaining control over my life. In the process, I became even more committed to setting strong boundaries, not just with my mom, but with everyone in my life. I realized that no one, not even family, had the right to overstep and cause harm. I had to protect myself and my family. I couldn't afford to let toxic people back into our lives, no matter how hard it was. After months of no contact with my mom, I finally began to feel at peace. There was no more constant anxiety or fear of what she might do next. I knew I had made the right decision, and while it was painful, I felt free from the toxic grasp she had held over me for so long. We were finally moving forward. My daughter was healing, and I was reclaiming my life. It wasn't easy, but I had learned that sometimes the hardest decisions are the ones that protect us the most. And in the end, that's all that really mattered. Update 5. It's hard to describe just how much things have changed in the months following the decision to cut my mom out of my life completely. With her finally out of the picture, the dynamics of our family started shifting. It wasn't immediate, but over time, I began to see the positive changes in both my daughter and in my relationship with my husband. My daughter, who had been so confused and unsure about everything that had happened, began to heal. Slowly, I could see her confidence returning. She started excelling at school, something I hadn't seen in her for a long time. Her grades improved, and she began to socialize more with her friends, something she had pulled away from while all the chaos was going on. I could tell she was more secure, emotionally stable, and comfortable in her own skin. She no longer seemed burdened by the weight of the manipulation that had been placed on her by my mom. Therapy had been a huge part of that progress for both of us. My daughter continued attending sessions, and I made sure we both went regularly. She started to trust me more and more, and we began rebuilding the bond we had always had. I realized that therapy wasn't just about healing the wounds from my mom's manipulation. It was also about strengthening our relationship. It gave us both the tools to cope with the aftermath of everything that had happened. As I continued therapy myself, I began to understand my own emotional patterns better. For years, I had struggled with guilt and people-pleasing tendencies. I'd always tried to make everyone happy, even at the cost of my own well-being. That had been part of the reason I kept enabling my mom's toxic behavior for so long. But through therapy, I started to learn how to set healthier emotional boundaries. I realized I had been prioritizing my mom's needs over my own, and over my family's for far too long. The more I learned about myself, the more empowered I felt to make decisions that were best for me and my family. My confidence began to grow. I felt like I was becoming the parent I had always wanted to be, someone who trusted their instincts and made decisions based on what was best for my daughter, not based on guilt or manipulation. And the difference was obvious. My daughter was thriving, and I was finally able to enjoy the peace we had fought so hard to create. The healing didn't just happen for me and my daughter. My husband became even more involved with our daughter's day-to-day life, and our relationship grew stronger as we worked together as a team. We spent more time focusing on each other and our daughter, making sure that we were providing her with a loving, supportive environment. It felt like we were finally on the same page, like we had faced the storm together and come out on the other side stronger than ever. As we rebuilt, I also began to redefine what family meant to me. It wasn't about blood relations anymore, it was about the people who truly supported and respected me, and most importantly, who supported my daughter. My friends and family who had been there for us during this time were the ones who showed me what true family was. They helped me regain a sense of normalcy and reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. I knew that cutting my mom out of my life was the right decision, but part of me still carried some guilt. I questioned whether I had done the right thing, especially when my daughter would ask about grandma. But as the months passed, I realized that this was the healthiest choice for all of us. The more time that passed without her in our lives, the more peaceful everything became. My daughter no longer had to worry about confusing messages or feeling torn between two worlds. She began to accept that grandma's actions weren't her fault, and I could see the relief in her eyes as she finally understood the situation. And then, about a year after I cut ties with my mom, I received an unexpected message. It was from one of my mom's friends, someone I hadn't heard from in months. The message was brief. My mom was still talking about me, but now she had no one to blame but herself. Apparently, she had been telling her friends that I was the one who had pushed her away, and that she was heartbroken, but at this point, it didn't matter to me. I had long since stopped caring about what she was saying to others. The weight of her manipulation was finally gone, and it felt freeing. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. I didn't have to constantly worry about my mom's next move, her next manipulation. I didn't have to feel guilty for choosing my family over her toxic behavior. The constant emotional turmoil was over, and I could finally enjoy my life without looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next crisis to come crashing down on us. Looking ahead, I know I'll never fully understand the person my mom became. I'll never know what happened to her, or why she decided to turn into someone who would go to such extreme lengths to hurt her own family. But I do know that I made the best decision for my daughter, and that's what matters most. We're stronger than we've ever been. My relationship with my daughter and my husband has never been better, and I'm looking forward to the future, knowing that I have the power to protect my family and keep the peace we fought so hard to achieve. And for the first time, I'm truly living my life for me. I'm a 29-year-old guy, and my story is all about the kind of drama that usually stays behind closed doors. But in my case, it spilled out, so here goes. I grew up in a strict household where success wasn't just encouraged, it was a requirement. My parents are both doctors, and for as long as I can remember, they had my entire life mapped out. Med school, a prestigious hospital job, the whole package. It was clear they saw anything else as a failure. In their eyes, a good life meant a fancy degree, high income, and the kind of career you brag about at dinner parties. It didn't matter what I wanted, it was all about keeping up appearances and living up to this image they had of the perfect family. Growing up, I tried to go along with it. I mean, what kid doesn't want their parents' approval, right? I studied hard in high school, joined all the clubs they thought would look good on a college application, even volunteered at a local clinic. But the truth is, my heart was never in it. What I really wanted was to be behind a camera. I loved capturing moments, creating stories through photos and videos. I'd spend hours watching tutorials online, experimenting with different techniques. It was my escape from the pressure of being the son my parents expected. But when I brought up the idea of studying film, they shut it down immediately. To them, it was a hobby, something you do on weekends, not a career. When high school ended, I made a decision that would change everything. I enrolled in a local community college's film program instead of applying to pre-med like they wanted. That's when the real tension started. It wasn't just disappointment, they saw it as a betrayal. They couldn't understand why I'd throw away the chance to make something of myself. They thought I was wasting my potential. But I was done with living a life that wasn't mine. My parents didn't take it well. After weeks of arguing and cold shoulders, they issued an ultimatum, switched to a practical major like engineering or business, or they'd stop supporting me financially. I was 19, stubborn, and tired of being controlled. So I told them I'd figure it out on my own and moved out of the house. I found a small studio apartment in a not-so-great part of town. It was tiny, barely big enough for a bed and a desk, but it was mine. I juggled a bunch of part-time jobs, bartending, waiting tables, even working the overnight shift at a 24-hour diner. It was rough, but I was doing what I loved, and for the first time I felt like I was living for myself. My parents, on the other hand, didn't see it that way. Over time, they grew more distant. Calls turned into short, awkward conversations during holidays. Eventually, even those became rare. My mom would ask about my real plans, as if I was just taking a break before going back to the path they chose for me. My dad barely said a word, his disappointment heavy in the silence between us. It hurt, but I kept telling myself that one day, they'd see I made the right choice. But that didn't come easy. Those first few years on my own were tough. I was barely scraping by doing freelance gigs here and there. Some weeks I wasn't sure how I'd pay rent or afford groceries. My film work was mostly low-budget weddings, events and promo videos for local businesses. Nothing glamorous. But I kept at it, figuring that as long as I could keep the lights on, I'd make it through. I remember one family gathering a few years in. It was a rare occasion where my parents actually invited me over. I thought maybe it was a chance to reconnect, but I couldn't have been more wrong. It was just an opportunity for them to tell me how irresponsible I was being. They went on about how I could still apply to med school, how it wasn't too late to get my life together. I tried to explain that I was building something different, but they wouldn't hear it. They looked at me like I was some lost cause, like I was throwing my life away. The turning point came when I landed a job filming a commercial for a local business. It wasn't a huge brand or anything, but it was a solid gig that paid well and got my name out there. One project led to another, and before I knew it, I had a steady stream of clients. My work started to get some attention on social media too. I'd post behind-the-scenes clips, little vlogs about the projects I was working on, and people actually liked it. It felt like I was finally getting somewhere. My parents, though, they still didn't get it. Anytime I tried to share my progress, they brushed it off, saying that freelance work wasn't stable, that social media was a waste of time. They'd rather talk about my siblings, my sister, who was on her way to law school, and my brother, who was already climbing the corporate ladder. It was like they didn't even want to acknowledge that I was doing well in my own way. But through all of this, I found people who did understand. I started meeting other creatives, people who knew what it was like to chase a passion and face the doubts and dismissals. They became my support system, the friends who believed in me when my own family wouldn't. I was building something I was proud of, even if it wasn't the life my parents wanted for me. Looking back now, I realized that moving out was the best decision I could have made. It wasn't just about pursuing my passion, it was about taking control of my life, even if it meant losing the support of my family. And yeah, I still hope that one day they'll see that I made something of myself, that I didn't ruin my life by choosing a different path. But even if they never do, I've learned to live with that. Update 1. So here's what happened after I started to get a bit of traction in my freelance work. Things were finally starting to look up. I landed a contract with a pretty well-known brand, something I'd been dreaming about since I first picked up a camera. This deal was big. It was going to secure me financially for at least a year. I'd be doing a series of promotional videos, social media content, and some photography work for their new campaign. To me, this wasn't just another gig, it felt like proof that I'd made the right choice. After I signed the contract, I decided to share the news with my family. Maybe, just maybe, this would be the thing that changed their minds about my career. We had a family Zoom call lined up anyway, one of those rare times when they included me in their plans. I thought it was the perfect opportunity. As soon as we got on the call, my parents went straight into talking about my siblings. My sister was set to graduate from law school with honors, and my brother had just closed on his first home. They were beaming with pride. When it was my turn to speak, I brought up the new contract, trying to match their excitement. I explained how this would open doors for more work and how it would cover my expenses for the next year. I even mentioned that the brand I'd be working with had a solid reputation, but the reaction wasn't what I'd hoped for. My mom's expression barely changed. My dad, too, looked like he'd just heard that I'd bought a new video game or something. They told me that freelance work is always unreliable and suggested that this phase wouldn't last. They didn't even congratulate me, just shifted the conversation back to my sister's graduation and how proud they were of my brother for buying a house at such a young age. It was like my news hadn't even registered with them. It stung, but I wasn't surprised. After the call, I vented to some friends online. I've built a little community there, other freelancers, creatives, and people who've been through similar struggles with unsupportive families. They were the ones who encouraged me to start a vlog series about the highs and lows of freelancing. So I did. I recorded my first video that same night. I talked about my journey, the struggles, the small wins, and the challenges of dealing with a family that doesn't understand my career. I didn't hold back on the details, and people really connected with it. The comments section was flooded with stories from others who felt the same, people who were pursuing dreams that their families didn't support. It was like a virtual support group. I didn't expect it, but the vlog started to gain traction. About a week later, I got an unexpected call from my aunt. Now, my aunt isn't someone I've been particularly close to over the years, but she reached out after seeing my vlog. She said she was proud of me for following my passion and building something on my own terms. She even mentioned that she knew it wasn't easy, especially with how my parents viewed things. It was the first time in years that someone from my family actually seemed to care about what I was doing. But when my parents found out about the call, they weren't happy. They accused my aunt of enabling my behavior, like I was some kind of delinquent. I didn't hear this from them directly, of course, they don't air out their grievances to my face, but my aunt filled me in. She told me not to worry about it and that she was just trying to be supportive. Still, it made things even more awkward during the next holiday call. Around this time, I realized I needed more help than just a few encouraging words from strangers online. I decided to start therapy to process everything that had been building up. It wasn't just about the career stuff, it was about years of feeling like I could never measure up to my parents' expectations. My therapist pointed out that their behavior wasn't just about me, it was about their need for control. And it hit home, and it helped me start seeing things in a new light. Meanwhile, my work was picking up. I met someone new, too, a fellow creative I connected with during a project. We clicked instantly. They understood the late nights, the unpredictable schedules, and the thrill of landing a big client after weeks of uncertainty. We started spending a lot of time together, and it was a breath of fresh air to be around someone who actually got it. They became a huge source of support as I navigated the ups and downs with my family. But just when I thought things couldn't get more dramatic, my parents took their criticism public. They made a Facebook post, one of those long, passive-aggressive ones, lamenting how some people forget the importance of family values and stability or whatever. It didn't take a detective to know who they were talking about. Some of my relatives saw it and reached out to ask what was going on, which made things even more awkward. I couldn't just let it sit there, so I left a respectful comment, clarifying that I was happy with my choices and that I didn't regret pursuing a different path. I kept it civil, but I made it clear that I wasn't going to apologize for following my passion. That comment blew up, and people shared screenshots of it on a few family drama subreddits. I didn't expect it to go viral, but it did, and suddenly I had strangers from all over giving their 2 cents. Most people were on my side, saying I had every right to live my own life. It felt surreal, seeing my story play out online like some kind of reality TV episode. But the weirdest part was how many people could relate to it. I realized that I wasn't the only one dealing with this kind of family drama, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't alone. After that whole ordeal, I took a moment to think about everything I'd been through since leaving home. I'd come a long way from those days of juggling 3 jobs just to make rent. My work was gaining recognition, my community was growing, and I was finally starting to feel like I was on solid ground. I wasn't living for my parents' approval anymore, and that felt like a win in itself. But deep down, I knew that the journey wasn't over yet. Update 2. So things got even messier after that whole viral comment situation. I thought maybe my parents would back off for a while, but I was wrong. Out of nowhere, they called me up with a new offer. They suggested that I move back home. They framed it like they were doing me a favor, promising to help with living expenses if I took on a real job. They even said they'd cover rent until I found my footing, as long as I agreed to find something more stable than freelancing. It was almost like they thought they could lure me back with a safety net, as if the only thing keeping me away was financial strain. But I had already been making my own way for years. My freelance work was finally bringing in steady income, and I was comfortable. Sure, it wasn't always predictable, but I'd built my life around that. So I turned down their offer. I told them I appreciated the gesture, but I didn't want to give up the freedom I had fought so hard to earn. I explained that I was doing well on my own and that I didn't want to move backward just to fit their idea of success. That's when the conversation shifted. They tried another tactic, hitting me with a classic ultimatum. They said that if I didn't move back, they would cut me off completely. No more invitations to family events, no more updates through the grapevine, nothing. It was a harsh move, even for them. It felt like they were drawing a line in the sand, making me choose between my independence and my place in the family. I thought I could brush it off, but then my brother called me the next day. He went on about how my decision was tearing the family apart, how everyone just wanted me to be closer, and how I should at least think about coming back for the sake of family unity. He didn't outright say he was on their side, but it was pretty clear. He mentioned how hard it was for my parents, acting like I was the one making everything difficult by choosing to live my own life. It felt like they had sent him to try to change my mind, a different kind of pressure tactic. After that call, I had this knot in my stomach. I started wondering if maybe I was being too stubborn, too focused on my own happiness. It was like I was being pulled in 2 directions. Part of me wanted to keep moving forward with the life I'd built, but another part felt guilty for standing my ground. My partner was the one who kept me from spiraling. They reminded me of everything I had gone through to get to this point, the years of struggling, the small victories, and how far I'd come since breaking away from my parents' expectations. They didn't tell me what to do, but they made it clear that I deserved to live a life that made me happy, not one that made my parents comfortable. It was the reassurance I needed to stay focused. Motivated, I threw myself back into my work. I ended up landing another big client, which led to a series of high-profile gigs. My schedule was packed, and for once it felt like the hard work was paying off. My calendar filled up with shoots, editing sessions, and meetings with new clients. It was chaotic, but in the best way. I barely had time to think about the family drama, which was exactly what I needed. But of course, the family updates still trickled in, whether I wanted them or not. My parents were busy helping my sister with a down payment on her new house. They made sure everyone knew about it too, like it was the ultimate example of how a successful child should be. It stung a little, seeing how they were so willing to support her while treating me like I was a disappointment. But I tried not to dwell on it. My aunt reached out again during this time, and her advice stuck with me. She told me that I needed to stop seeking validation from my parents and focus on the people who actually supported me. She said that sometimes you have to build your own version of family. It wasn't easy to hear, but she wasn't wrong. Inspired by that conversation, I made a vlog about setting boundaries with toxic family members. It was one of my more personal videos, and I wasn't sure how it would be received. But the response blew me away. People started sharing their own stories about difficult family dynamics, and it went viral again. This time, it even caught the attention of some media outlets. I got invited to do a podcast interview, and a creative industry magazine reached out, asking if I'd write an article about my journey. When my parents found out about the interviews, they dismissed them as internet fluff, saying that being popular online didn't mean anything in the real world. They doubled down on the idea that I should still come back home, get a real job, and stop chasing after dreams that wouldn't last. It was like they couldn't see the value in anything that wasn't part of their narrow view of success. But my online community had my back. Strangers from Reddit, followers from my vlog, they flooded the comments with encouragement, sharing stories about breaking away from controlling parents and building lives that made them happy. It made me realize that I wasn't alone in all of this, and that my story was actually helping others feel less isolated. A few weeks later, my brother called again, but this time the tone was different. He admitted that he envied my ability to follow my own path, even if he didn't always understand it. He confessed that he sometimes wished he could do the same, but felt trapped by expectations. It was a moment that showed me that even in families that seem perfect on the outside, there's always more going on beneath the surface. By the end of it all, I came to a realization. I had spent so many years living for their approval, but now I was finally living for myself. I wasn't going to sacrifice my happiness to make them comfortable anymore. It felt like I was shedding the last bit of guilt that had been holding me back, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly free. Update 3. Not long after my brother's unexpected confession, things took another turn. For a moment, I thought that maybe we had reached some sort of understanding, but just as quickly as he'd expressed that envy for my independence, he flipped back to my parents' side. It happened during a family group chat, of all places. One day, I woke up to a barrage of messages in the chat. My parents had sent out a long thread about family values and the importance of staying close-knit. It was the same old story, but this time, they directly called me out, claiming that my refusal to come back was tearing the family apart. They said I was being selfish for not considering the strain it put on everyone else. And then, right there in the chat, my brother, who had been the one to admit he envied my freedom, suddenly started backing them up, repeating their words almost word for word. He talked about how disappointed he was that I couldn't put family first, how he wished I would think about more than just myself. It felt like a script. And the weirdest part? My sister, who usually stayed out of these things, chimed in too, saying that I'd changed, that I wasn't the same person I used to be. It was like they'd all joined forces to try and guilt trip me back into line. Seeing their messages piled up like that, one after another, hit hard. It was like they decided to gang up on me. I shut my phone off and went straight to my partner, needing to vent before I lost my mind. I laid it all out, the sudden switch in my brother's attitude, the constant guilt tripping from my parents, and now my sister joining in. It felt like they were trying to break me down piece by piece. My partner didn't say much while I talked, but when I was done, they just reminded me of one thing. I had to focus on the people who actually supported me, the ones who were happy to see me thrive. They pointed out that I had built something real, something meaningful, and that I shouldn't let my parents' refusal to see that ruin everything I'd worked for. They didn't sugarcoat things, but I needed that reality check. A few days later, I got a call from my aunt. She'd heard about the latest family drama, and we ended up having one of those deep conversations that last for hours. She told me that sometimes the best thing you can do is live your life without waiting for other people's approval, even if those people are your own parents. She said she was proud of me for staying true to myself, and that if my parents couldn't see the value in that, it was their loss. I thanked her, feeling like maybe there was at least one person in my family who got it. But my parents weren't done. They called again, this time pulling out all the stops. They brought up how worried they were about my future, hinting that their stress over my decisions was affecting their health. They didn't say it outright, but the implication was clear. They were blaming me for any strain they were feeling. It was a new level of manipulation, and it left me frustrated and drained. That was when I knew I had to set some new boundaries. I told them that while I respected them and understood they had their own perspective, I wasn't going to tolerate the guilt trips anymore. I said that I wasn't going to sacrifice my own well-being just to fit back into the life they wanted for me. It was the hardest conversation I'd ever had with them, but I kept my cool and made my position clear. After that, things got even more complicated with my siblings. My brother took my parents' side completely, saying he couldn't understand why I wouldn't at least try to find a compromise. My sister, on the other hand, was a bit more understanding, but she also said she didn't want to get involved anymore. It felt like I'd lost one sibling and was barely holding on to a relationship with the other. In therapy, I worked on detaching from their expectations. My therapist helped me see that I couldn't control how they chose to react, only how I responded to it. It was hard, but little by little, I started finding ways to validate myself without needing their approval. I poured all my frustration into my work. Not long after, I got an invitation to speak at a major industry conference. It was a big deal. People I had looked up to for years would be there, and now I was one of the guest speakers. I threw myself into preparing for it, putting all my energy into making sure I nailed my presentation. Around the same time, my social media hit a major milestone. I reached a follower count I'd never thought I'd see, and I made a post thanking everyone for their support, sharing a bit about how far I'd come. It was one of those rare moments where things seemed to align. People flooded the comments with congratulations and stories about their own struggles, and it reminded me of why I started sharing my journey in the first place. But of course, my parents found a way to dampen the moment. When they heard about the conference, they brushed it off, saying that anyone can be famous online these days. It was just another way to dismiss what I'd accomplished, to remind me that in their eyes, my work still wasn't real. But this time, I didn't let it get to me. My online community had my back, and I focused on the people who believed in me. Strangers shared their own stories of dealing with unsupportive families, and it felt like we were all in this together. Then, out of the blue, my brother called again. This time, he apologized. He admitted that he had felt pressure from my parents to speak out against me, and that he regretted taking their side. He said that deep down he respected what I was doing, even if he couldn't say it at the time. It was an unexpected moment of honesty, and I appreciated it. But I made it clear that while I was open to making things better between us, I wasn't going to back down from the boundaries I'd set with our parents. That conversation felt like a turning point. I realized that I could stay open to the possibility of reconciliation without sacrificing myself in the process. And for the first time, I felt like I was finally in control of my own story. Update 4. The invitation to speak at the industry conference came through just when I needed it most. It was one of those events that had been on my radar for years, a place where the best in my field gathered to share their stories. This time, I wasn't just attending. I was one of the keynote speakers. It felt like a big break, a chance to show that I'd made it on my own terms. I threw myself into preparation, rehearsing my speech until I could recite it in my sleep. As the date got closer, I hoped, maybe foolishly, that my parents might acknowledge how big this was for me. But they didn't seem interested. Instead, they kept talking about a cousin's graduation that was happening the same week. They acted like my event was just a hobby, something that didn't really matter. It was clear where their priorities were. A few days before the conference, my phone rang. It was my parents. I figured they might finally ask about my speech, but instead they asked if I'd be coming to the cousin's graduation. They emphasized how important it was for the family to all be together, how much it would mean to my cousin. I knew what they were doing, trying to guilt me into showing up, hoping I'd drop my own plans for theirs. I explained that I couldn't make it, that this conference was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me. I tried to keep it polite, but firm. I told them it wasn't just another gig, it was something I'd worked years to achieve. But they didn't want to hear it. They got cold, quick. They accused me of being self-centered, of caring more about my career than about family. It was like they couldn't see the irony in what they were saying, considering how little they'd supported me. I hung up, feeling the chill of their words, but I refused to let it mess with my focus. I had a speech to deliver, and I wasn't going to let their disapproval ruin it for me. The day of the conference came, and the room was packed. As I stepped up to the stage, nerves mixed with excitement, but I pushed through. I talked about my journey, about the struggles of freelancing, about choosing a different path, even when the people closest to you don't understand. The audience was engaged, nodding along, and I could see that my story was resonating with them. When I finished, the applause felt like a wave washing over me. After the event, clips of my speech started circulating online. People shared it, tagging their friends and talking about how they related to my story. It went viral, faster than I could keep up with. My follower count shot up, and suddenly I was getting messages from brands, new clients, and people just saying that my words had inspired them. It was surreal, seeing that something I'd said could reach so many. A local news outlet picked up on the buzz and reached out to feature my story. They did a piece about my journey from struggling freelancer to industry influencer. It was a bit strange seeing my life laid out like that, but the positive response made it worth it. More people found my work, and my inbox was flooded with opportunities. For the first time, I felt like all the sacrifices had paid off. Then another surprise came through. My brother, the same one who had switched sides during the family drama, reached out again. He congratulated me, admitting that he was genuinely impressed by how far I'd come. It wasn't the most emotional message, but it felt like a small step towards mending things between us. But just when I thought the family drama might be settling down, my parents decided to stir the pot again. They posted one of their classic passive-aggressive messages on Facebook, something about how family values are disappearing in today's world. It was vague enough that they could deny it was about me, but everyone knew. Relatives started reaching out, asking if something was wrong, which only added to the awkwardness. I thought about responding, about setting the record straight again, but then I stopped myself. I realized I didn't need to keep justifying my choices to them, or anyone else for that matter. Instead, I chose to focus on the support I'd been getting from my followers, friends, and the people who saw my journey for what it was, something worth celebrating. My partner, who had been my rock through all of this, surprised me with a celebration dinner. They'd set up candles, cooked my favorite meal, and even had a little cake with congrats written on it. It was the kind of thoughtfulness that reminded me I was surrounded by people who cared about me, even if they weren't the ones I grew up with. That night, my aunt sent me a text, too. She wrote that she'd seen the news feature and watched the clip of my speech. She told me how proud she was, how she knew how hard it must have been to keep going without the support of my parents. It meant a lot, knowing that she saw my efforts. Old friends from high school and college started reaching out, too. They'd seen the news coverage and wanted to reconnect, saying how impressed they were with what I'd built. Some even admitted they never expected me to make it this far, but they were glad to see I'd proven them wrong. It was strange having people from my past reappear like that, but it felt like another sign that I was on the right path. After everything settled down, I made a post on my social media reflecting on the journey so far. I thanked everyone who had supported me, from the online community to the friends who'd stuck with me through the tough times. I talked about how much it meant to have people believe in me, even when my own family didn't. The post blew up, and the comments were filled with stories from others who'd had to distance themselves from toxic situations to find their own happiness. It was like I'd found a whole new kind of family, one made up of people who understood what it meant to struggle, to push through, and to build something out of nothing. And in that moment, I realized that the love and support I'd found with them meant more than anything I could have gotten from my parents' approval. It wasn't the end of the story. Family dynamics don't just disappear overnight, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was finally at peace with the choices I'd made. And that, more than any viral post or job offer, was a victory worth holding on to. Update 5. The last straw came during another strained phone call with my parents. By this point, I had gotten used to their usual comments, but that time they took it a step further. They said my success was just a phase, that eventually I'd come to my senses and realize that freelancing wasn't a real career. They made it sound like all my hard work, all the milestones I'd hit, were just temporary detours before I inevitably crawled back to the path they had laid out for me. It was exhausting to hear the same dismissive words over and over, especially after everything I'd achieved. I could feel the constant negativity creeping into my daily life, and I knew I couldn't keep letting it get to me. That call was the moment I realized that for my own peace of mind, I had to make a clean break. So I decided it was time to go no contact with my parents. I didn't want to just disappear without explaining myself, though. I knew that if I did, they'd probably twist the story to make me seem like the bad guy to the rest of the family. So I sat down and wrote a letter. I kept it respectful but firm, laying out why I was choosing to cut contact. I told them it wasn't out of spite or anger, but because I needed space to focus on my own well-being. I emphasized that I hoped they'd understand one day, but that I couldn't keep putting myself in situations that made me feel small. I sent the letter and for the first time in years, turned off my phone without worrying about what their response would be. When I turned it back on, the mixed reactions were waiting for me. My brother, who had apologized before, sent a message saying he understood and hoped we could still keep in touch. But my sister? She wasn't having it. She accused me of abandoning the family and said I was being selfish for walking away. It stung, but I knew I couldn't let it sway me this time. In therapy, I talked through the decision, and my therapist validated what I already knew deep down. I had every right to protect my mental health. It wasn't my responsibility to carry the weight of my parents' expectations. Talking through it made me feel like I wasn't just running away, I was choosing myself for once. It was a relief like nothing I'd felt before. It was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders, and suddenly I had more room to breathe. My partner, always knowing how to make a moment special, surprised me with a gift a few days after I sent the letter. It was a framed photo of me on stage during my viral conference speech, a reminder of how far I'd come. They said it was a symbol of the moment I took control of my own story. It was one of those small but meaningful gestures that I'll never forget. My aunt, who had been my one consistent ally in the family, reached out again. She said she understood why I needed to take this step and promised to stay in touch. It felt good to know that I hadn't lost everyone in the process. She made it clear that she'd be there for me, without the judgment or pressure. With my parents out of the picture, something shifted in my life. Suddenly, I had more energy, more focus, and my career really started to take off. I landed a few high-profile gigs, collaborating with brands I'd only dreamed of working with before. It felt like without the constant stress hanging over me, I could finally put my all into my work. The opportunities kept coming, and I found myself thriving in a way I hadn't before. When I shared the news of going no contact with my followers, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People left comments sharing their own stories of difficult but necessary decisions, and it felt like we were all part of the same journey. They told me that hearing my story gave them the courage to set their own boundaries, and that was more validation than I ever could have asked for. During this time, I built deeper friendships with people who understood what I'd been through. Some were fellow creatives, others just people who valued the same kind of peace and independence I did. It was a different kind of community, one where I didn't have to justify myself or prove my worth to anyone. It made me realize just how important it is to have people in your life who see you for who you are, not for who they think you should be. Months later, I got an unexpected message from my sister. She admitted that after thinking things over, she'd started to see how toxic our parents' behavior had been. She didn't apologize directly, but it was the closest she'd come to acknowledging that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the villain in this story. We're not fully there yet, but it felt like a step in the right direction. I told her that I was open to staying in touch with her, but that my no-contact boundary with our parents wasn't going to change. It wasn't about cutting ties forever, but about protecting my own space. After all that, I decided to write a post reflecting on the journey I'd been on, from breaking away from my parents' control to building a life that was truly mine. I thanked my followers, my friends, and the people who had believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. I talked about how hard it had been to walk away, but how worth it was to find my own path. The post went viral, and the comments were full of people saying how much they related, how they'd gone through similar struggles with their own families. It felt like a full circle moment, knowing that my story was out there, helping others feel less alone in their own battles. And now, looking back, I realize that I've built a life filled with love, creativity, and self-acceptance. It's not perfect, and I'm still figuring things out, but for the first time, I feel like I'm living on my own terms. The shame and guilt that my parents tried to use against me don't weigh me down anymore. Instead, I've learned that real family is the one that supports you for who you are, not who they want you to be. And that's a piece I never thought I'd find.